Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. I believe it is still afternoon for those of you on the East Coast. We're really happy to have you here. We really are quite excited about today's Imagining America Teaching and Learning Circle. We're joined by the authors of The Activist Academic, Engaged Scholarship for Resistance, Hope, and Social Change. All things we know we desperately, urgently need today. So we're really quite excited to be joined by the authors, Colette Cann and Erica DeMeulenaere. We're so excited to have you here. We're also thrilled that Margo, Okazawa and John Saltmarsh, who wrote the foreword and the conclusion to the book, are also joining us. It's really quite an honor to have you here. And to guests and participants, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. We know that, boy, these are not easy times to focus, right? These are not easy times to have difficult conversations. Some of you may be struggling with getting a syllabus together or moving one online. You might have family in your midst running around, toddlers, kids, and teens. You might have ill loved ones or friends. So with everything going on, we have here in the Davis, California region, the headquarters of Imagining America, we literally have ashes falling from the sky as we're surrounded by 3 wildfires in Solano, Napa, and Yolo counties. So what crazy times, what precious moments to have these important and even more urgent conversations. So really thank you all for joining us, and thank you guests. We really look forward to this conversation. Before we get started, we're going to do a couple things. First, I'd like to give you just a kind of brief tech reminder about how this will work today. And then Colette will welcome us to the space before we invite you to also introduce yourselves in the chat function. So quick reminder, we had 305 people register for this conversation. So some of you are already here. Some of you will be joining on shortly. So unfortunately, you do not have audio or video capacity today. So in our smaller webinars, we love to have a really interactive and messy conversation. But today, our community space will be the chat bar. So many of you probably have been on Zooms and webinars quite a bit recently. But if you haven't, go to the bottom of your screen, of your Zoom screen, and find the button that says chat and open that up. And if you look to the right, people are already introducing themselves and saying they're happy to be here, and feel free to do so. So this will be our community space today. Sometimes there'll be directions and prompts that invite you to chat in that space, and other times it's really a free space for us to ask questions and make comments and share resources. So please do use that. If you have any problems with tech capabilities, please reach Pepiro, tech@IA. Pepiro, if you could write a hello and a greeting into the chat so people know where to find you. Pepiro can help you there. We also have Trina, Imagining America's Director of Membership, with us, who behind the scenes is following your questions in the chat. So we will collect them there for the question and answer portion. Also, remember when you do write something in the chat to write to everyone, not just to panelists, so that our participants and colleagues can see what you're commenting on here, not just the panelists. Unless you do have a private message for a panelist, you can obviously feel free to do that as well. So I think I failed to introduce myself. I'm Erica Kohl-Arenas, the Faculty Director of Imagining America, also faculty here in American Studies at UC Davis. And again, it's really my honor to facilitate this conversation. I loved the book. I enjoyed the book. Myers Education Press is even offering all of you all a 30% discount if you go and say you've registered for this webinar and attended and would like to buy a copy of the book. There's so much richness and important urgent work captured in there. So before we get started, I'm going to turn it over to Colette Cann, who is going to bring us together into this space before we invite you as well to introduce yourselves in the chat. Thank you so much, Colette.
Hello, everyone. Glad to be here with Eric, John, Margo, Erica, Trina, Mina, Pepiro, and Aaron. We wanted to open today, following up on the last webinar by Imagining America, with both a land acknowledgement and a Black Lives Matter acknowledgement. And I'm going to just say a few words about why, building on the brilliant, amazing work of Eve Tuck, If you haven't read her chapter, Biting the University That Feeds Us, it's a free PDF book that came out maybe 2 years ago. She opens with this argument that white supremacy, particularly in the US, but globally, is really about the creation of property and also out of people and out of land. And so I want to open with this beautiful piece from page 150 in her chapter. And I want to read her words because they are just kind of on point. In the United States and other slave states, the remaking of land into property was and is accompanied by the remaking of African persons into property, into chattel. This can be connected to neoliberalism's ideation of the flexible landless workforce. The remaking of indigenous land and Black bodies into property is necessary for white settlement of other people's land. In settler colonialism, indigenous erasure and anti-Blackness are endemic. This is why indigenous, trans, and cis women in Canada are asking, am I next? While organizers in the United States have to remind us again and again to say her name, to bring attention to Black women killed by police, often in custody. Black and brown trans women have been murdered at devastating rates. The violence is all connected, and indigenous theorizations of settler colonialism and Black theorizations of anti-Blackness flay open those networks of connection. With that connection, it feels important to us then to open with both a land acknowledgement and a Black Lives Matter acknowledgement. And for those for whom a land acknowledgement is new, wanted to offer a little bit of background on a land acknowledgement. So a land acknowledgement is a statement that recognizes the indigenous peoples who have been dispossessed from the homelands and territories upon which an institution was built. And this feels particularly important when we're talking about land grant institutions and other institutions of higher ed, and currently occupies and operates in. For some, an indigenous land or territorial acknowledgement might be an unfamiliar practice, but it is a common practice within indigenous communities in the United States and is a standard practice in both Australia and Canada. So I wanted to add to that, I don't know how many folks are familiar with Resmaa Menakem's work. If you haven't, you should certainly put your hands on a copy of My Grandmother's Hands. He offers another way of thinking about the land acknowledgement that I want to add here. One of the first things that I always like to do is acknowledge the fact that my feet right now are on native ground, and that something happened and something continues to happen here. And that this country has created institutions and strategies to make Native people, indigenous people invisible. And so whenever I'm doing something, I always want to acknowledge that something happened and something continues to happen to our brothers and sisters that were here before most of us got here. I would ask that you keep that in mind, that you don't be so quick to push it away, and that you also remember your ancestors as I remember mine. Eve Tuck also then wrote with Wayne Yang, who recently spoke here with IA, about the land acknowledgement not being enough, that we have to move beyond the land acknowledgement so it doesn't become a performative act, right? Just a thing that we do at the opening, but that it is, it holds meaning that dreams action into being, right? And so without continuous commitment to serve as accomplices to indigenous people, institutional gestures of acknowledgement risk reconciling settler guilt and complicity and rescuing settler futurity. And so here in this moment, as we offer the land acknowledgement and the Black Lives Matter acknowledgement, we want to acknowledge that the acknowledgement in and of itself is not enough, right? And this is hopefully what we're also here to talk about, and whether it's in the chat or not, what that means to take action in this moment when our dreams, right, are under siege. So I'm in the East Bay in El Cerrito. Offering a land acknowledgement here is a way to constantly acknowledge that I am on occupied indigenous land that here in the San Francisco Bay Area includes Ohlone territory. To not do so is to contribute to the amnesia of a country that profits from its attempt to disappear people or make it seem as if a people have been disappeared. And so in a moment, we're gonna ask that you consider renaming yourself and or putting it in the chat box, your name, your pronouns, and where you are zooming in from. And you're also welcome, if you know what land you occupy, to also acknowledge the land that you occupy wherever you are. As we are thinking about anti-Black racism together with the erasure of Indigenous folks, we want to then also acknowledge, do a Black Lives Matter acknowledgement. And here we call on the words of Alicia Garza to talk about what that is and why that's important. When we say Black Lives Matter, we're talking about the ways in which Black people are deprived of our basic human rights and dignity. It is an acknowledgement that Black poverty and genocide is state violence. It is an acknowledgement that 1 million Black people are locked in cages in this country. 1/2 of all people in prisons or jails is an act of state violence. It is an acknowledgement that Black women continue to bear the burden of a relentless assault on our children and our families, and that assault is an act of state violence. Black, queer, and trans folks bearing a unique burden in a hetero-patriarchal society that disposes of us like garbage and simultaneously fetishizes us and profits off of us is state violence. And so here, we wanted to add one more thought, which is to acknowledge that many of us are sheltered in place, right? And so this calls for us to be together in a very different way. And so we wanted to add here Cheryl Matias and Naomi Nishi's work on what it means to be a mother scholar, because to be a mother scholar, for those who are in the parent crit lit, is to do our work in a very particular way. And when sheltered in place, that looks like a very, very different thing. And so I want to open here to just note that I myself identify with this inseparable identity of being both mother and scholar, both and, not either or. Mother scholars do not engage in scholarship, even specific to parent crit, without engaging in my role as a mother, and as much as I also engage in my role as a scholar. And so for those of you who are parenting and with as most generous a definition of what parenting might look like, we welcome you into this space. And so we want to offer that the space that we share today be inclusive. And we are going to borrow here some norms from the principles of the Black Lives Matter movement to hopefully guide how we are together. Not that we are together today, but how we are going to occupy this space together. So the first is to please embrace loving engagement. So in this time together, take radical care of yourself and others around you. If you need to step away and do whatever you need to, we are not going to be insulted by that. Please take care of yourself. This is a family-friendly Zoom, and so be mindful of that as you, what you put in the chat, and we'll be mindful of what we put out in the space. And this is also to say that I, in this space, will not apologize. I have 4 children and there are 3 adults in the house, and they might be speaking to me as I'm speaking to you. I'm not going to say, I'm so sorry, hold on, I'm going to just, in fact, somebody's standing right here to ask a question. So we don't apologize for families, right, as we are sheltered in place. The type of listening that we invite you into in this space is reflective, resonant, and active. In the chat box, please feel free to move up and move back. If you are chatting a lot in the box, perhaps move back and take some time to read what your colleagues here are offering. And then finally, and Margo has a wonderful way for us to be in community at the end of this call related to this, but to remember that we're here to do love, study, and struggle with joy. That yes, we are working for freedom and justice for Black people, and by extension, all people, but we intentionally build and nurture a beloved community that is bonded together through a beautiful struggle that is restorative and not depleting. So we'll pause for 1 second if you would like to take a screenshot to hold on to these, but these are the norms that will guide how we are together today. And I'm grateful to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colette, for that important and necessary grounding. Before we begin, we'd love to welcome you in this spirit into the space to introduce yourself. It looks like a lot of you have been. I love to see that people are already greeting each other. For this first prompt, if you haven't already, let's write our name and the land or place or institution from which you join us today, in the spirit of Colette's prompt and principles and reminders. So I come in today from the Patwin lands of the Yocha Dihi Winton Nation, and from UC Davis, that is a land-grant university complicit in theft of those lands. So in response to Colette's prompt, I work to organize and right relationship to reparations and living right with this land in the Patwin people's land. So welcome, folks, and please do continue to introduce yourselves, name, place from which you come, and please read and greet your colleagues, as I've noticed folks have already been doing, which is beautiful. Hi, David, also from Davis. Nisanan Lands in Sacramento. Monica, hello, welcome. So many friends and family members of IA here in the chat. Welcome, welcome. So please continue to do so if you haven't yet. Hi, Dave Campbell, good to see you there. We miss you here in Davis. Continue to welcome your friends and colleagues. Let's now also, if you've already introduced yourself, write 3 words about who you are so we can kind of see who's in the room and the community together. So I'll begin to do so. Writer, teacher, and as Colette, I think I used to just think mother and scholar, but now I'm going to say mother scholar. Thank you for that, Colette. So please feel free to introduce yourselves and who you are. I'm writer, teacher, mother, scholar, gardener. Welcome, Paul. Artist, teacher, dad. Lauren, educator, coalition builder, poet. More gardeners, welcome. Postdoc. Fathers, teachers, organizers. PhD candidates, cooks, mothers, seamstresses. Black feminist, hi Gail. Teacher, gardener. Theatrical, physical clown, welcome. Welcome, Jerem. Friend, teacher, gardener. So please continue to bring yourself to the space and introduce yourself and who you are and all your multiple identities and skills. And also now, we'd like to take a minute to think about one burning question you have about activist academics or activist scholars today in this moment. What's on your mind? What are you thinking about? What's that one burning question or thought or theme that's running through your mind as you are about to engage in some thinking together with Colette, Eric, John, and Margo? What are some questions you might want our authors and scholars and visitors to engage together over the next hour together? Please do feel free to write those one burning question into the chat. And we're gonna sit again and just kind of welcome one another and wait for a couple questions to emerge. As we do so, I'm going to share a little bit with you about the order in which we'll do things today. So please do write that burning question you bring with you today into the chat after you've introduced yourselves. Today I'm going to start with some introductions, slightly lengthier introductions of our guests. After that, I will have a question for all 4 of our guests to really answer together about what it means to be an activist scholar and activist academic today. I'll then turn to Colette and Eric to talk a little bit about the book and their intentions and how the book now for them, what meaning it brings to this moment in time when it is published and out in the world in a really different moment probably when they started working on it, although many enduring challenges as well. I'll then turn to Margo to reflect a bit back on connected movements of the past to the present moment, and then turn to John, who wrote a really beautiful afterword to the book to talk a bit about the really dense meaning packed into this short letter to a review committee he wrote as a creative method to writing the afterword. And after that, we'll open it up to you. I have, believe me, 3 pages worth of questions to ask our guests about this book. We're going to pause and turn it to you, though, to see what questions you have on your mind before I ask additional questions beyond these opening questions for our wonderful guests today. So let's take a minute to look at some of these questions. From Karen, how do we position activist scholarship as the norm in higher education? From Lauren, how do you address the addiction to American individualism that is and continues to lead and instead towards a deep collective and prevention of harm approach? How can we link the experiences of different countries and see this health crisis as an opportunity today in this moment? So do take time to take a look at your colleagues' questions in the chat. Really great questions. And again, as I said, Trina will be collecting these questions and returning to some of them when we open up for discussion. So now it is my honor to introduce Colette Cann and Erica DeMeulenaere, who are the authors of this really beautiful and engaging book. I really thoroughly enjoyed reading it, and I love that John introduced us and said, hey, how about an IA conversation? So it's really quite my honor to introduce the two of you. Colette Cann is the mother of Saliha Dorothy Cann Polentz, daughter of Elmira Winston Cann and Robert Nelson Cann Jr., and granddaughter of Dorothy Cox Cann, Robert Nelson Cann Sr., Jesse Wilson, and Curtis Wilson Sr. She recently joined an all-mother Scholar of Color leadership team at the School of Education at the University of San Francisco as an Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, Research, and Faculty Advancement, and Associate Professor in the International and Multicultural Education Department. She's a founding member of a collective of racial literacy educators who co-teach courses for K-12 teachers and parents on race and racism in schools. In higher education, she teaches and writes in the areas of critical race theory, praxis and methodology, intergroup dialogue in higher education, and adult racial literacy. She's published widely. I highly recommend you take a look at her work. She, as well as Eric, is also a graduate of the Social and Cultural Studies and Education program at UC Berkeley, as am I, and I didn't realize this when we first met one another. So we have something in common as graduates of that crazy program that is lucky it's still surviving, you know, these precarious radical programs. So good to see you here as fellow alums of SES, I will say. So welcome, Colette. Erica DeMeulenaere is an associate professor in Clark University's Education Department. Prior to joining Clark University's faculty, he taught middle school and high school social studies and English and coached soccer in Oakland and San Francisco, California. In 2004, he co-founded and directed an innovative small public school in East Oakland that focused on social justice and increased academic outcomes for youth of color. Before opening the school, Eric earned his PhD in the SES program I just mentioned, and he has consulted with urban school leaders and teachers nationally and internationally to transform their pedagogical practices and organizational school cultures. His research employs participatory action research and narrative inquiry methods that you will see throughout this really beautiful book, and draws extensively from critical theory to examine how to create more effective and liberatory learning spaces. Welcome, Eric. It's such an honor to have you both here with us. Margo, Okazawa Ray, and John Saltmarsh, who are mentors to both Erica, Colette, myself, and countless others, refuse long introductions. So I will not do that. Instead, I will welcome Margo so much. We're really honored to have you here. I do want to say Margo is a member and an early member of the Combahee River Collective in Boston during the 1970s, and has really been a lifelong scholar activist. So if you haven't learned about Margo Okazawa Ray, I seriously encourage you to look up her work. I do want to say she has a book out from 2009 around activist scholarship as well, if this is a topic you'd like to explore further. So welcome, Margo. We're honored to have you here. She wanted me to introduce her as a mild-mannered school teacher and as DJ OR, and she will end us in a dance and a song at the end. So for many reasons, we're honored to have you here, Margo. John Saltmarsh is a dear longtime friend to Imagining America. He made many significant contributions to Imagining America's vision, mission, values, and organizing approach as a member of our National Advisory Board, and is also really widely published on democratic, civic, creative, and community engaged education. So I really highly recommend you look up John's work as well. So thank you all. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It's really quite an honor to have you here. My first question really is quite a simple one, given the numerous amount and depth of questions I have for you. But the first one is really a welcome to each of you to talk a bit about what does activist scholarship and activist academic mean to you today, and why is it urgent and important? As we're suffering through a global pandemic, this particular moment in the long arc of the Black freedom struggles, as well as the heat and climate crisis around us, and of course, countless other challenges. Why is activist scholarship important today? So I'll start with Colette.
You know, I think I'm going to speak specifically to what activism in the academy looks like, acknowledging, recognizing that scholarship starts within and also starts without the institution. It's not just about the institution when we're talking about knowledge production and activism. But I feel like at this moment in time, it's important to acknowledge the responsibility that academics as institutional agents specifically have to kind of collectively dream and imagine ways that institutional resources can be used to kind of extend this broader net of care and love and concern for students in our classes, students, and how that's affecting their families, and even beyond that, of course, right? Our communities in which our institutions sit, those who are affected by my particular area of focus in education is around race, racism, and racial justice. And so just more broadly, families in the K-12, K-16 system. And so, you know, when I think about what that means at this moment in time, for me, it means, you know, well, so I'm gonna use it, but I mean it in a particular kind of way, but for me, it means laundering our resources, right? So there are ways in which money is allowed to be used and supposedly not allowed to be used, but how can I use my imagination to think more broadly about what counts as student scholarship or student work in classes, right? So we had 2 students in our grad program who in March, they both teach and they're grad students at the same time. And they were like, this is a really important time when everyone goes online to learn, to maybe think about what it could look like to have a high school that's all Black educators, right? If we know that the Black teaching force has been decimated in part by the outcome of Brown versus Board of Education, how can we lean into this moment? And so they started a school called Making Us Matter. And it was an online virtual school, all Black educators. And so, you know, as I'm thinking about our final project why wouldn't I allow that work if it touches on or some way intersects with the work that we were focused on in class? How could I not allow that work to count for it, right? Or why would I hire a research assistant to work on my research? Why can't I pay them to continue doing that work, right? It doesn't have to be about me, and it doesn't have to be about this kind of rugged individualism and about like, how can I get ahead? But when I'm thinking about laundering that money, I'm thinking about like, how do we think about the institutions to which we're attached or we're embedded or we're fighting against, however, you know, whatever your relationship with that institution is, how do we think flexibly about making sure that those resources are extended as far and as wide as possible to embrace people right now, right? Not to, and I feel like there's been a lot of talk, I don't know, you know, everyone is deciding whether or not they're going to be online or in person, and can we do that, and can we afford that? And there's just very little conversation about how we can use this moment to support students, or how we can use this moment to support students' families, right? It's about whether or not our institutions can bring students back and put them in chairs and make sure they're 6 feet apart. It's almost a ridiculous conversation, I have to say. And very little conversation about how can we, Gloria Latson-Billings, I think a student was telling me, I didn't hear the talk, but I guess she had posed the question, how are people preparing to embrace students who are returning in the fall after having witnessed in a video the murder of a Black man by a police officer? That young people have seen this video over and over again over the summer, right? Like, that's not a conversation I'm hearing people engage in, right? So how can we, if the question is, how can we think of the role of the activist academic right now in this moment? It's about how we can use the institution's resources to embrace people, right? Not the institution itself, not how can we keep the institution alive, but how can we care for people?
Thank you so much, Colette. Just as the, example of basic needs syllabi and how to deal with trauma and syllabi is becoming, absolutely so essential amidst all of this, and none of the conversations in higher ed that we're seeing about the kind of broader structures are addressing it. Eric.
Oh, there's so much here. Thank you, Colette, and thank you, Erica. And I'm so honored to be here with all of you. I guess for me, as I think about even just the title and what it means to be an activist academic, I guess for me, I would consider myself a reluctant academic. Like, I didn't go to grad school to become an academic. And in fact, I was very afraid of being an academic. I wanted to get the credentials and the power, basically, and the knowledge to do work in communities. That's why I started a school. I actually only became an academic because Margo told me that it's a space where you can do you have a lot of freedom with time, so you can keep doing your activist work and get a paycheck. And so I was like, okay, I can figure that out. I got kids I got to feed. And, I had started a school and literally got fired at that school. And there's a larger story there. But when I entered into the academy, I was a little scared. And I remembered, reading Gramsci in grad school and saying that, like, a lot of people who are public intellectuals think they're independent from the systems of oppression, but in fact, they're completely complicit. And so I was like, how do I not become that, right? And what does it mean? And I had identified as being an organizer and an activist and a teacher, and becoming an academic in some ways made me afraid. And I thought of the academy as this ivory tower that was distant and separated from the activist work I had done. And so in entering, this book is actually, I think, an outgrowth of Colette and I's conversation to try to both build community but hold ourselves accountable to not become complicit, right? And really think about what that means. And I think more and more, that's an ongoing struggle, because and I think particularly today, right, we see that the forces of capitalism, of white supremacy at play in our world, like, maintain the status quo. Like, even as I would think that in these crises, it would be a time for us to really rethink education, really rethink what our purpose is. And yet I find the push back to the status quo to be really powerful and compelling. And I was in another conversation that Margo organized, and a colleague from McAllister, what's Donna's last name?
Donna Maeda,
like, raised this really profound comment, which is like, we're thinking about, what's the risk of reopening K-12 schools, colleges, and like risking human lives. And the question she sort of posed was like, what about, there have been times in the past where people have actually risked their lives for education. Do we think that what we're offering in my classroom, in my university, is actually worth risking a life? What would an education look like that I would be willing to risk my lives for? And I feel like that question, that's not the question that we're asking. We're asking these really kind of very questions about, is there enough ventilation in our classrooms, and how do we keep social distancing, and stuff like that are very technical and nothing that's fundamental. And so I think for me, and I may be way off tangent here at this point, but as I think about what it means to be an activist academic, I feel over and over again like that the realities of our world should be pushing these really fundamental questions, and it should force us to not only engage with that in our institutions, but it also, and for me, I guess, as I thought about the activist academic, it also became really clear that we're in a time now where ideas alone, like, I think a lot of people in scholarship think that they can just publish or speak new ideas and that will lead to change. And I think we've seen this rise of a sort of an attack on ideas. And so part of the work we have to do in change is not just thinking that ideas will actually manifest. And I know, as someone who's worked in education for years, we know a lot about what works, and we blatantly just ignore and disavow it. And so how do we actually then do the work that takes ideas into practice, and that becomes, so that we're not just idea creators, we're not just critical thinkers, but we're actually transformative folks who are about creating social change with communities and actually doing the rising up groundwork that has to happen at the grassroots level, in addition to sort of bridging that with theory. And so I don't know where I was going with all that, but that's what came up for me. So I'll pass it on to whoever's next.
Thank you, Eric. Really appreciate it. Margo.
I want to start my comments first by thanking everybody. This is fabulous, and especially congratulate Eric and Colette. And I'm going to come back to you all later in person, I hope. I want to start by, jumping on both what Colette and Eric said with a question. And I think as activist scholars, activist academics, however we define ourselves in those terms, right? To whom are we accountable? And for what are we responsible? Do we think we're responsible for, right? And it seems that's an ongoing kind of question that I've asked myself in the several decades I've been in the academy. The second thing is, there was a question in the chat about how can we make activism the norm in the university? Well, activism has always been the norm in the university. That's one of the main reasons that universities continue to maintain the position, right? And their activism is about maintaining the status quo, right? Their activism is about justifying intellectually racism, scientific racism and all those things. So don't think for a moment that they're not activists. We're engaging in a different kind of activism, right? And their God, their referent is, this idea of objectivity and neutrality. And I found this wonderful quote I think is perfect for today. And it's by Eduardo Galeano, who says, "Those who make objectivity a religion are liars. They are scared of human pain. They don't want to be objective. It's a lie, right? They want to be objects so as not to suffer." And I think if you take the essence of that, what we're saying is, well, what I'm saying as an activist scholar is that we are in the process of remembering, right, all the things we've been told to forget because they don't matter. And all of us who've been in doctoral programs know that we were really rewarded for forgetting where we came from, forgetting all the different ways that we know stuff, right? That our grandmothers, our great grandmothers knew how to do, right? Those are not important because they're not objective, right? The kinds of research that we're committed to doing are not objective, right? Because it's about our own people, and it's about, the conditions our own people face. And so I think two things about what it means to be a scholar activist in this moment. First of all, it means that we are rejoining, right? Well, maybe it's not even rejoining, but joining, right? The inside with the outside, recognizing that it's a both and moment. This is, if there was any other time in history where it's a both and moment, I think this is it, right? Both the university and the community, right? Among other things. The other thing is that in the same kind of conversation that I was in with Eric, somebody gave an example of working with faculty around this mentoring in this moment and faculty advising, right? And she gave the example of a faculty member who told her this story. One of the students, right, as the faculty member was saying this schedule, this how the Zoom is going to work, whatever, all the technological things that Eric was referencing, the student asked, "Will anyone die?" Right. will anyone die as we're going back to school? And so as activist academics, if we were asked that question, right, what would be our answer, right? What would be our answer? How would we answer that? But even before how would we answer it, what do we need to understand about what that student is asking? Right? So for me, being an activist scholar means to think about the questions that we need to be asking in this moment, right? And to go into a deeper understanding of things that, you know, are repeated all the time, you know, that become sound bites, right? So Black feminism, intersectionality, all these concepts, right? What do we actually mean? What are people actually saying? And most important, going back to Colette's point, is how do we actually practice what we say matters? And again, to whom are we accountable and for what are we responsible? I'll just stop here.
Thank you, Margo. And last but not least, John, on importance of academics or scholarship today.
Yeah, thanks. And again, thanks, Erica, for hosting this.
And John, you might want to speak up ever so slightly.
Let me turn this up too. Okay. I just want to thank Colette and Eric for their wonderful book and their ability to raise these issues in that book. When I think about the activist academic, I guess I'm sort of thinking about where we are in this moment and how it's different. So I wrote the afterword almost a year ago, and we're in such a different place right now. So what's different? Like, how do we think about it in terms of trying to make sense out of that? And so, you know, I think about an activist academic as being someone who's really critical to our institutions of higher education, because they're the ones that are raising the key questions about our society, but they're also raising them in ways that connect with those that are outside the academy, with the basic principle that those who are closest to the problem are most likely to be able to solve it. So they're coming at the work differently, but at the same time, our institutions aren't supporting that work. Right? And so there's this sort of major disconnect, and we can come back to that too. And I just think that we're in a different time right now. And I wonder if we've sort of hit a tipping point. Here's just one example. I work with a group of scholars where we've been trying to explore the question of epistemic injustice, how certain epistemologies are either marginalized or accepted, validated or delegitimized. Right? And so trying to understand that within the context of the scholar's identity. And it's really wonderful sort of literature and theory. But the last conversation that we had about this was one of the scholars who's part of this said, you know, on my campus, I could talk about epistemic injustice and people would kind of get what I'm getting. But the conversation we're actually having is about systemic racism, and they get that, right? So what's the difference, right? Why is it that we can talk about systemic racism now as part of our institutions and our policies at our institutions, where we just weren't talking about that before? Something shifted, and there is this sort of racial reckoning that I think is happening not only across the country, but in higher ed as well. And with that racial reckoning, I think is an opportunity to rethink the whole notion of where does an activist academic fit in an institution of higher education? Because these things aren't disconnected. So that's sort of what I'm thinking about. It's not like we need them more than we needed them before. I think we did need activist academics before. I think the institutions are perhaps in a different place right now in terms of understanding how central they are to the institutions in a weird sort of sense of sort of interest convergence. I don't know if that's actually going to play out, but I'm hopeful that there's some major change that can take place.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you all for centering this conversation. I'd like now, and gosh, of course, the time is flying and so much to talk about. And I'd like to take this moment to really turn to Colette and Eric to have a conversation with one another and share with us a little bit about your book. So the question is, you know, this book was not just a book, it was a project, it was a relationship, it is a relationship and a conversation between the two of you in your kind of earliest years on faculty lines and finding your way as scholars in institutions that didn't always greet you hospitably or really understand the depth of your work or the conversations we're having here. So I'm wondering if the two of you can share with the participants here a little bit about your book and the process of writing it together and how you would describe the power and the importance of this book today. It was called in the introduction kind of a roadmap for activist scholars. We have doctoral students, we have all sorts of folks on the line here today who I'm sure would love to see that roadmap, but it's also more than a roadmap. It's a relationship, and you see a growth and a change of your own thinking throughout the course of the book. And it touches really, I think, on the deep relationship between oneself, one's identity, one's research, one's teaching, and one's scholarship, and connection to community surrounding university institutions. So it's quite a layered piece of work. And so I'm wondering if the two of you can maybe discuss with one another and us here how you hope this book reaches the world today.
I'll start then. You know, I think we write about it in, I can't remember which chapter, but where we sort of talk about this critical co-constructed autoethnography, which is this big way of saying sort of the style of writing and that we sort of were claiming. I think we were inspired by all these other spaces, the talking books that Paula Freire would do. There's this great piece that Bell Hooks does where she interviews herself as Gloria Watkins, talking about Paula Freire. And then there's a lot of people who in critical race theory use kind of narrative and story to sort of capture stuff. And I think for me at least, so much of my learning comes from failure, mistakes. It comes from conversations, relationships. The best thing about conferences, I think, are what happen not when papers are presented, but what happens in the conversations in the hallways, in the lunchtime sessions where you just have a conversation with someone. And so much of my learning is built off of so many small conversations that happen here and there. And when we read most things that are produced in the academy, it feels like all that gets removed, right? The process of learning is taken away, and growth and mistakes and even the other pieces that I think were really important for me at least, and Colette as well, is the humanness, like love, sense of humor, laughter, the complexity of trying to do this while your kids are, you know, I mean, I can't tell you how many conversations we had with not only kids jumping in on, you know, a Skype call, but also like at the roller rink or, you know, or different places where you're out and about. And that notion of humanity, I feel like was really important. And I guess I would say that I think that's even more pressing today, right? I mean, I think we're talking about so much stuff that's life and death, right? About breath and breathing. And you know, how do you do this work as human beings who get tired and cry and need to laugh and all of that? And so I think for us, capturing some of that, what I would call the process, right, was really important, and sort of pulling back the curtain a little bit and sort of and capturing some of the messiness of life that's all part of this, that I think, at least for me, made me feel like an imposter all the time when I was in the academy, right? So I feel like people just look to you, you know. I remember when I got my PhD, I think people suddenly thought I was smarter than I was before I got it. And that is definitely not true. You know, I don't know what, but anyways, I think that for me, that process piece is super important. And even how we got to writing this, I mean, we try to capture some of that the late night calls where Colette's like, I have a different way to write this. And our first drafts were like written almost like a play, right? Where we just had characters and stuff. And so we played with some of that. And and then at the end of the day, you know, I think we were reminded of Audre Lorde's notion that the master's tools will never dismantle, and felt like we were trying to think about different ways of capturing. And so I think that was really important. How do we make ourselves vulnerable? And so for me, that was, I think, a really critical component. I also feel like, you know, as an activist scholar, and activist academic, right? And I make a distinction because I feel like I work with all kinds of high school youth and teachers and others who I'd call activist scholars who wouldn't necessarily identify as activist academics, right? So much of my learning is actually getting out of the way and giving a voice for other folks. And so for me, this writing was really trying to capture my own process of learning and put that into words that I've learned from so many other amazing folks who I get fortunate to work with. And so, you know, that thinking about that, which was interesting because at the end, like, we don't know what genre this is, right? Like it took us like, I mean, I thank God for mentorship by John Saltmarsh and stuff, who connected us with one person who connected us with another person. We finally got a new press who was willing to take this on because it has some academic theory, but it also is kind of a memoir and a like co-written memoir, which doesn't exist in a lot of places. And so, you know, just even figuring out a place for where it could go was tricky for us. So that's a little bit, I guess I'll pass it on to Colette. I probably should just pose some questions to you and listen to you.
I do have to say, Colette, as you're thinking how you want to bounce off and build upon Eric, that the humanizing factor and the mistakes and even the arguments between the two of you were so refreshing in the context, right, of talking about people in roles who we often have to prove ourselves and pretend to fit into other frameworks that are not our own and that aren't really about the work we're trying to do. And I laughed really hard at the conversation around your schematic on evaluating the impact of public scholarship, because some of you are like, yeah, I didn't do so good here, or yeah, I was up high on the scale here, because usually the selling of the dossier, right, of proving your work to inside academic audiences means you have to talk about the work in ways that don't really fit at all. And so a lot of the humbling conversations between you and about your own work were really, it really did come off the way that you're describing you had hoped it would. Colette.
I don't have much to add to that. Thank you, Eric. You covered so well. It's like you're in my head. I guess what I would say, what I would love to add, if anything, is I'm still caught on one of the questions that came up in the chat about how to move activist scholarship from the margins to the center. And I guess in thinking about that, and then also hearing what Eric said, there's a way in which some folks, maybe all folks, don't have an opportunity to be academics in the way, that sanitized version of being an academic, the path that you're sold in order to get tenure. And so you don't really have a choice. You have to move the margin to the center to be recognized and to move forward. And I say that to say, when I first took on my first academic position where I got tenure, someone asked to speak with me who had just retired from our department. And her advice to me was that I needed to parent whenever I needed to parent, but I was going to have to still get in the same hours of being an academic, whether that meant being up until 4 o'clock in the morning or, you know, whatever that was, but that you can't get tenure unless you do the traditional path, the dominant path to academia. And I thought to myself, you know, what exactly are you saying to me? I can't be myself. I can't be a Black single mother scholar, and I can't continue to teach at the K-12 level, and I can't do these things that make up who I am and teach how I want to, which if I'm going to teach about race theory, that means some people are going to be pissed off right off the bat because they're going to be in a class that they just don't think it should even exist. And so I can't be myself and be in academia. And that set the tone for the next, my next 7 years getting tenure. And one way to get through that was to be in conversation with Eric, who was also doing something that meant that the work he was doing was not being recognized as work that belonged in the academy. And so the book was about, first of all, it couldn't have been written if there weren't people who had done work ahead of time, right, to allow that to come through. And then the book itself is also about reaching back for the folks who are trying to come up behind us and get tenure and say, here's some ways that we did it. And here is, you don't need our permission to do it, but let's just tell you what happened for us. And here's some, where we had to dodge and weave and whatever it was. And so I think of the book as hopefully a contribution, because even the writing of the book was risky, right? Like whether or not anybody is going to consider that valid, whatever scholarship, but it was really about trying to create space for other folks to continue to do their work, and whether or not they're like, I'm gonna do it even if I know it's not gonna count, or I'm gonna do it, but you're doing it because it's kind of who you are and how you choose to do your work. And so I guess the thing that's been coming up for me is this word how. It's like the activism is in the how. It's in the how of how we want to do our work. It's in the how of how we mother. It's in the how parent. It's in the how of how we teach. It's in the how of what we count as scholarship. It's in the how of who we do that work with, right? Like it's in the how that it becomes so critical and important. And sometimes the how, you don't have any choice, because the how is just so intricately connected with who you are. And so to me, the book is a response to the question of like, how can we do this work with integrity? How can we do it with fidelity to who we are? How can we do it as ourselves? How can we do it in line with what's important to us? How can we do it in line without betraying people, right, who are important to us? Like, and who cares about betraying the institution? And yet to do work that's not acknowledged, and then that if you don't create space for other folks behind, it makes it harder for folks behind you who are coming up behind you, that is, to then do that work. Like it's so important, right? So it was important to us to write the book in the way that we did. It was important to us to make visible the mistakes, or I don't know if you want to even call them mistakes along the way, but to be transparent about all of that so that we're not, kind of fronting and sanitizing it so that then other people feel like they have to as well. So I don't know. I mean, I'm caught deeply in the question yet, so I don't really have like a tight answer to it. But one of the things, just to model that transparency, one of the things Eric and I talked about before the session today was how we have so much on our minds right now, right? Like macro, micro, like, it's 2 o'clock. I don't know which of the 4 children have eaten 2 meals quite yet. I'm hoping that the elders, the 13 or 14-year-old made it all happen, or one of the other 2 adults, but like, I just have like 1,000 things going in my mind. Have I eaten? Like it's all there. And are people safe? Like, I'm just thinking of all of that. And I was like, I don't know, Eric, if I'm going to really be able to put together a coherent thought today. And like, I don't know. And Eric was like, well, but that's kind of the point, right? Like, don't show up and act like you do have it all together, because that's the modeling of the fact that we have a lot happening. And so what is the most generous, loving, kind, caring way to treat ourselves and others is to just show up, right? And do you in that moment, I guess.
Thank you so much, Colette. I really appreciate it. And Piero and I huffed ourselves and our computers over to the office in raining ash with children at home in our houses, because as our facilitators and people online and spouses in other meetings, we wanted the stable Wi-Fi, and then we look outside to see that it is unsafe to be outdoors either. So I hear you with the distraction in our full selves. And as an anecdote, because I'm sure many others had this similar experience, the requirement to not be our full selves. When I was going up for tenure, I was told that, you have these midpoint reviews. I was at the new school, and I love my colleagues at the new school, but I was told, and I will keep that person, will remain anonymous, but that I needed to spend less time with students, and I needed to teach less to be more successful. And as you all know, I'm sure, that's also teaching less and being with students less in a context where other people are denying students time, advising time, or feedback time when they've been long in the career of following that advice, right? So the younger folks coming up being told to follow what the successful, prolific scholars at the top did are perpetuating a pattern for students who are hungry for time and space and support, which ultimately is what we're here for, right? So I deeply recall that side of myself being encouraged to disappear for a little while to get the book done, right? So I really appreciate what you're saying here. I'd like to turn to Margo now. Thank you so much, both Eric and Colette. It is such a rich book, and I think you really touched on parts of why it's important both to you and the field. Margo, I'd like to ask you a question about, we've been there before. So activists, as you said, academics, whether they're maintaining the status quo or trying to lift and leverage and take resources in alliance with communities and movements, is not new. And so I'd like you to, maybe in the introduction of the book, you talked about what you call the golden era of social movements, the 60s through the early 70s, and the days of the Third World Liberation Movement that were really, in some cases, storming the gates of higher education to create ethnic studies and other changes in higher education. So I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit with us about then and now. What's different now? What from these movements has really help to change and create spaces in higher education? What are the battles still to be fought? And if you could comment on, but of course, whatever strikes you as most important right now, but what you call the kind of, in the introduction, the conundrum of the structural contradictions of being an activist, academic, or a radical thinker or movement ally within conservative mainstream, or even we can say racial capitalist institutions. So how even kind of then and now you would think about this structural contradiction of doing radical work in seemingly unmovable institutions.
Yeah, and I just want to say, just respond, Colette, to your point about the how. And as you were talking, I was thinking, what are the values and the purpose embedded in the how? Right? Because the how seems like it's just a method or things you're doing, and I'd like us to, and everybody to really think about the values, right? And how do the hows reflect the values that you say you are about? And how does the purpose, right, reflect that as well? And also, when I was a doctoral student, my advisor was going up for tenure, and a bunch of us loved her, right? And we said, we want to write you support letters. And she said, please don't, because being loved by students is the kiss of death. Well, there you go. I think that says it all. Anyway, I think it's a both and moment, right? I think in my generation, and I just retired, I'm 70, and I just packed up my office yesterday and I'm done, right? In that sense. When I started as a student, and then later, the main advantage, I think, the earlier generation of academics, not my generation, but the one maybe half generation older than I am, the main advantage we had is that there were active movements happening, very identifiable, and many of us were engaged in it, and that we were called by the movements to create something that's relevant. It wasn't the other way around. We didn't go out, academics didn't go out looking for things, right? That many of us weren't even academics, at that point, but we were deeply embedded in these movements. So for example, the early ethnic studies courses, the women's studies courses happened in communities, right? They happened in communities, and they happened when we invited, faculty people, or as faculty people, we were invited to come do things, or we said together, our faculty our teachers, let's said, let's have a teach-in, right? That was a really important methodology, wasn't it? A teach-in, right? Where we were in the community organization doing the teaching and learning, and the gap between teachers and learners was, what's the word? What's the word you all are using these days? Problematized or whatever, right? That they were made fuzzy, right? And we understood that we needed to learn from one another, and thinking about, what what's the process. And popular education, of course, was certainly part of it. There was also a kind of discipline, whether you were an activist, in quotes, or an academic. There was a real commitment to learning theory, right? And generating our own theories. So now, and economically, it was at a really different point, right? The economy was open because of the US war in Vietnam, right? Remember, we live in a war economy, war-based economy, right? And so there were so many openings, right? The rents were cheaper, the material conditions of people in my generation, were really different. We were not saddled with $100,000 student loans that, as and all of those things that you all know about, right? There was a kind of an opening, right, that you don't necessarily see. Neoliberalism had not set in the ways it has. It was on its way, with the restructuring of the economy and all of that, but it wasn't set in place like it is now. So it's hard to say, and I say it's a golden era because we also had a very internationalist perspective. And one thing I'm very nervous about right now is that so much is focused on the US, and so much is focused on one, kind of dominant group of people, a dominant paradigm. And this idea of racial capitalism also bothers me, because capitalism is also absolutely gendered, right? And so is police brutality and state violence. So one of the things that we were able to do, because we were in the communities, we could learn that we couldn't just use one phrase that would then become the buzzword, right? We had to keep thinking. We had to learn from the so-called dope fiends, in the drug treatment facilities that we were having classes with, et cetera, right? And so that activism was very much rooted in communities. We didn't go out to the communities, right? We were pulled by the communities, right? We were pulled in, and we were really impelled to be in those communities. So it was a golden age in the sense that there were these vibrant movements, right, happening. And as you all know, the movements kind of were successive in the sense that, contradictions within a movement then created, another movement, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a kind of a dynamism, at that point. It was also the golden age because there was a real internationalist commitment, right? And I think we need to come back to that. So I'll just leave it at that. So, and there were so many contradictions within that, right? And conundrums, which I hope to talk about later, that were created as a result of straddling these contradictions. And I think the contradictions are deeper now in some ways. And I think the question I want to end my part with is, when does a structural contradiction become hypocrisy?
I'll let folks catch their breath because I am. Thank you so much, Margo. I wanted to turn to John before we have a kind of open dialogue on all these really important questions and tensions and threads. And maybe John, use my prompt as an opportunity to also respond to Margo and this question of when do these structural tensions and contradictions become hypocrisy. I think that's actually a great lead-in to my question for you. So take it in the direction in which it sits with you right now. But I'm hoping you can share with the participants today a little bit about your approach to writing the afterwards to the book, which was really as a letter to a committee, as a promotion committee. And you did a lot in that letter. One was making the case that the very book you are writing an afterwards for is scholarship. But you also set forth some propositions about some really important values and principles and practices for doing activists engaged in public scholarship. So you highlight in it some of the tensions Margo concluded with, right? That these institutions already, for some reason, are structured to not recognize the values that you posit are so important. So can you share a little bit here? I know that's a big loaded question, but.
Sure, thanks. I also just want to say to everybody who's on the call, you're getting a really good sense of what this book is about. You realize that Margo is the person who raises the best questions. And you got from Eric and from Colette kind of the counter storytelling that's going on, right? And it's in that counter storytelling that we're getting a deeper sense of what it actually means to be in the academy, particularly if you're trying to do this kind of work. So I just want to say the afterword that I did was very much inspired by the book itself, in the sense that I felt like I had some license for creativity. But it was mostly inspired by the last chapter. So in the last chapter, Eric and Colette are in conversation with a number of other scholars. And all of you have at that point achieved tenure, but you're all in serious angst about what does that actually mean? What does that mean for who I am? What does it mean for how I position myself in my institution? And what does it mean for the work going forward? So it's not like this celebratory chapter. And so what I took away from that was that what really needed to be addressed was not so much the scholars or the scholarship, but the institution. So I wrote the letter in a way which was really to just address the institution and those who are making the decisions in the institution. And in that last chapter, one of the key questions really becomes, am I a scholar who is in but not of this institution? And what does that mean? And I think for many of the scholars in that conversation, they didn't want to be of that institution because they saw that institution as being highly oppressive, historically marginalizing, and didn't want to compromise themselves. They didn't want to become part of the hypocrisy. And so the only way to do that was to be in but not of it. And so part of what I do in that letter is to try to bring those questions to the surface in a way that's asking, as we think about what counts, because we do that, we figure out what counts in the academy because it's what's legitimate and what gets validated. As we think about that, let's think about who we want these scholars to be in our institutions. And can we create the institutional environments that will really allow these scholars to thrive? And I use that really deliberately in an abolitionist educational sense, not to just survive in the institutions. They had all done that, right? They'd all done that. They were successful. They got tenure. You could say no harm, no foul. But the reality was they really didn't see themselves as part of the institutions. They felt like they were continually marginalized. They felt like their work wasn't validated. And so as we think about that from an institutional perspective, what do we really want to have happen when we think about what counts? And in that what counts piece too, and again, I think the book is just brilliant about this. It raises the questions about how do we think about impact, right? And we have such narrow ways to think about scholarly impact. So what if we actually rethought that and broadened it out? They raise the questions about who's a peer, right? Who is a knowledge peer when we're doing peer review? Right? Is it just a credentialed academic, or could it be those who actually have knowledge who aren't credentialed, who are in the community, who actually know these issues better than a credentialed academic? Yeah. So they're raising all these sort of key questions, which are questions, we raised in IA for years, right? But now through a slightly different lens. And again, what I'm trying to do in that last chapter is just to bring it back to the institution. And that's why the title of it is Up Against the Institution. So I thank the two of them for kind of giving me the opportunity to sort of have that ability to just look at it differently and write a different piece.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, John. We really only have about 10 minutes or so to address questions that you all have and that Trina's been collecting in the chat here. There's clearly so much to talk about. For all of you who have asked the question, yes, we will save the chat and we'll organize it and save all the resources, and we'll actually do the research to find some of the citations and recommendations folks have made that you've been asking about in the chat. So we'll do that and share with everyone. Really appreciating this conversation. And one thought before I turn to some of the questions in the chat, this conversation about being in but not of the institution, and pairing that with Margo's opening questions around who are you accountable to and responsible for, and what are the values of your work. I think that we are not in the what you call golden era, especially economically, financially, health-wise, in so many dimensions, but we are in a moment when movements are calling us to ally and share resources and respond. And so I think perhaps maybe that's a future conversation. Movements that from the outside have been pushing and working with institutions of higher education. I'm thinking the Debt Collective, that's a student-run organizing effort trying to tackle debt. I'm thinking parts of the movement for Black Lives and organizing with Barbara Ramsby, who started the Scholars for Social Justice, that has had platforms that are trying to push higher ed from outside in. So I would love for a future conversation to perhaps invite movements who, as you say, from the golden days of the 60s, where there was no question about what should I be doing, but there was pressure from movements coming in, calling for scholars and activists within higher ed to bring resources and thought and projects to the movement. So I'd love to look at that in the context of today. So really, really deeply appreciating this conversation. I've collected myself some questions, but I have, as a facilitator, not paid 100% attention to the chat. So I'm gonna turn to Trina for a minute and see if, Trina, you have a pulse on maybe the most frequently asked category of questions. As the first question we might wanna ask from the audience here today.
Well, I did feel like there were quite a few questions that actually got answered as folks were sort of talking along, but there were several questions that involved, I think, working with students. So when you are an activist academic, right, and you're working with either graduate students or especially undergraduate students, how, I think some of the questions were all around like showing up in that space, modeling vulnerability was one thing that had come up, and then offering that opportunity for students to really see you as you are, right? So I was wondering if the panelists might talk to that a little bit. I don't know that that was covered quite as well as some of the other questions that came up throughout the chat.
If anyone wants to respond, I did share with the panelists in advance that the teaching chapter is one of my favorite chapters, and there's so many great examples of ways to think about teaching in the context of activism and organizing and community university engaged work. So anyone, would you like to take up that question? Teaching in the world of Zoom? Anyone? Margo?
Well, Eric and I took students to Highlander Center, which was just a fabulously transformative experience. Not everybody can do that, but something that, we did at Highlander was play together. And I'm wondering, the role of play and having fun, and in my case, having students dance to start the class, or having them teach me dancing during the lunch hour on the plaza or something. But really, having undergraduate students, see us as real people, right, I think is really important, particularly in this moment when students are asking questions like, is somebody gonna die?
Well, and I'll echo, like, the other thing we did at Highlander, not last time, but the time before, Margo and I think Margo did this, where we just were downstairs and we were breaking into groups, and Margo was like, you and I are just going to form this little group. And we sort of talked about our work as teachers a little bit. And then we sort of, then we had to share out. And in our conversation, we talked about sort of all our vulnerabilities and our struggles. And then we shared out and kind of just put that out there, right? Like, like, I mean, like, it matters whether or not my students like me, right? And like, I read the evaluations with trepidation and stuff, and those things are real, but it's like not the stuff we ever talk about. And it's always vulnerable to do that. And yet I think it also fostered, I think I had more close connections with people from the other universities that were there than I had in previous sessions because of that vulnerability. And one of the things my students taught me, like I used to do a project with, I still do some of it, but with youth who come, and we would do critical media literacy, and students would make films about issues that they felt like they weren't being represented in the world. And over again, I found that students were taught to be ashamed of things that in the end made their stories amazingly powerful, yes. Right? So I remember the students made a case, they wanted to make a film about youth and immigration, and a student sort of came out as being undocumented. It was the first time he had told anybody outside his family. And then that brought several other students to talk about it. And they ended up deciding to make this film. And, there's all kinds of things we need to think about in terms of care and protection. But what in the end were the things they were taught to be ashamed of were the very things that were transformative as they told their counter stories. And then they realized there's a power in that story. And I think, when I became a teacher, initially, I was basically taught to not be my authentic self, right? To sort of, I literally had teachers that don't smile till Christmas, and and work with children, but don't be caring, don't be loving, don't be forgiving, right? Like you got to be tough, otherwise they'll take advantage of you. And this whole idea, and so my lessons from students is like, if they can be vulnerable and open, and that's a form of power, then isn't that true for me, right? And so I talk about pain and struggle with my students, and try to connect with them as human beings. And I found that in fact the opposite is true, right? Rather than making them feel like, it changes the hierarchy, but it also changes like, notions of motivation, right? Like, why
can I just add something though, Eric?
Go, yeah.
You can do that, as a tall white guy,
yeah, absolutely.
Right? You can be emotive and all of that. But I think as a starting assistant professor, I would not have shown my emotion because we're already thought to be, presumed incompetent, right? And crying, remember Patricia Schroeder when she cried or something and that nixed her, candidacy, right? So it's a double-edged sword. And I think we have to kind of disaggregate, right?
Yeah,
now, at the end of my career, toward the latter part of my career, I didn't give up, if people thought I was incompetent or not. So I could freely emote and be emotional. But I think in the earlier parts, if I'd done that, I would have just been stereotyped as an emotional Black woman or whatever, right? And so that's part of the contradiction and the tension. And Colette, you kind of alluded to that a little bit. So I just want to lift that up and say, it's also developmental, right? And it's about our social location. And we still have to be real, no matter what. I just want to put a little something in there, Eric. And by the way, Eric and I both cried at Highlander when we were doing that presentation.
Thank you for that. And I think the kind of metaphor of does one call themselves by their first name, or professor or doctor or whatever, maps along those lines as well for people starting out.
Exactly.
Colette, did you want to add?
I was thinking about what does it mean to work with and mentor students right now. And now I don't know. I got so many thoughts in my head because I'm coming up behind Eric and Margo, so I got new thoughts. I don't know what to do with them. But my initial thought was, for me, it's always meant making space for them to dream and create. And whether that means, as you know, I mentioned before, laundering money, creating opportunity for them, framing things for them in a way that the institution, you know, can make some space, whatever that means, but making room for them to dream and be a different kind of academic. You know, I would like to think 20 years from now, people are going to look back at this moment and be like, oh, is that what academics did? You know, I'd hope that we're like, you know, at this other place, but we can't get there if we don't make room for them to be a different kind of academic, right? And not have to dance a certain dance, right? At the same time, though, I also think a part of it is, you know, acknowledging that grad students, myself included, came up through a particular system and being successful in that system. And sometimes that meant demanding certain things that you weren't getting, right? Because nobody thought you deserved it. And so sometimes what happens, or a lot of times what happens, is that when the two of us then meet, they are still fighting, right? So they're still pushing and pushing, but I'm not pushing back. I'm like, no, what do you want? Let's figure out how to make that happen. But sometimes they get so caught up in that previous way of engaging that it takes a while. Like, you have to give some room for them to, like,
Right.
to get into a relationship with you in a way that I think sometimes students are written off, like, oh, that student is too pushy. Like, we have to acknowledge how they got to where they are, right? And then be like, okay, I'm not pushing back. I'm not, or they're demanding things of me that I'm saying, I don't think that that's important as your idea, right? Like, I get that you want this, but like, let's get down to your idea. What is it that you want to do? But they're still asking for this other thing that in the end of the day isn't, it's not the thing of who they are. And I'm trying to think of I don't know, you know, students who are putting together their dissertation proposal, and they're like, I need to know the right way to do it. I'm like, okay, let's just back up. What is it you want to do, right? And so I need to both hear that, yes, they're acknowledging that there's some rules to academia, and I can't just say discard the rules, and I've got to somehow address that, and I still have to make sure that they're dreaming what their original dream was, right? And sometimes in the mix of that, it like, there's this piece where I have to say, I hear you, and we will talk about the how to write. And what was your dream though, right? Like, let's go back to that so we don't lose track of that. And so I think of mentoring as, and this is not a new idea. I mean, I think Lisa Delpit talks about this so much, and Lori Lesson-Billings talks about this so much around teacher ed, and I think it's relevant here in the mentoring. But how do we, maybe even it goes back to the both and that Margo brought up before, like, how do we mentor them both for what it is that they are asking for, and also making sure that they are being mentored into this new reality that, like, I don't want to see that dream die as they move forward.
So I think that was the most beautiful, perfect note to thank our guests for having such a beautiful conversation. We do like to end on or close to the hour to honor the commitments folks have made to this time. I do want to say, you know, at Imagining America, we're engaging in research on really changing and pushing on higher ed to do more activist, engaged, and public work. And for almost everybody we've interviewed thus far, teaching and pushing for the spaces Colette, you just so beautifully shared, came up in almost every single interview. That teaching is a space that gives faculty and students joy, right? And spaces and ways to think differently and to imagine how we want to be in the world and what we want to see different. And so I thank you so much, Colette, for that beautiful comment about imagination, about creativity, about also the long and repetitive work, right? It takes to work into relationship for people to understand that their dreams and their hopes and their selves matter, and ways of being matter. So really, I feel so at a loss of words to sum up when we're beyond time, because we want to hear Dr. OR's music so we can DJ ourselves out of the space. But most importantly, I want to thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation. Please ask remaining questions about your own work in the chat, because as we DJ our way out, our DJ also asks that you leave your burning questions in the chat about your own work, because once a movement organizer, always a movement art organizer. And Margo said, I'd love to know what people are struggling with in their own work and lives. I'd love to know what they're struggling with as students, as staff, as faculty, as mothers, as organizers, as artists. So as we DJ our way out of this space, we'll thank Margo for that, but also please leave your burning question in the chat, because who knows, it might be a future TLC webinar, or who knows, we might reach out to you to talk about it at greater length. So thank you again all so much for being here, for taking the time. Thank you for writing this amazing book, and everybody go get it. It's pretty powerful. And thank you, the authors, and also John and Margo. What an honor to be here with you at this moment in time. So let's enjoy some music, and please write your burning question in the chat.
Everybody stand up and dance and listen to these words.